Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit living room of her small, worn-out house. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was the only sound that broke the heavy silence. Her frail hands clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a receipt for yet another withdrawal from her bank account. Hello. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. It was not the first time this month, nor the first time this week. Her son, John, had taken the last of her pension money, leaving her with nothing but a gnawing sense of despair. John was her only child, and Sarah had raised him alone after her husband passed away years ago. She had worked hard, sacrificing her own needs to ensure John had everything he needed. But now, at 70, her life was far from the peaceful retirement she had envisioned. Instead, she lived in constant fear of her son, who had become a stranger, a man who cared for nothing but his own pleasure. As Sarah sat there, her thoughts drifted back to when John was a boy. He had been so full of promise, with bright eyes and a curious mind. But as the years passed, something had changed. John became more withdrawn, more focused on material things, and less interested in school. He dropped out of college, refusing to work or contribute to the household. Instead, he spent his days sleeping and his nights out with friends, drinking and partying. Sarah had tried to talk to him, to encourage him to find a job, to make something of himself. But each time she brought up the subject, John would explode in anger, accusing her of nagging, of trying to control him. Over time, Sarah learned to keep her concerns to herself, swallowing her fears and frustrations. Tonight was different, though. As she stared at the empty cupboards in the kitchen, Sarah felt something inside her shift. She could no longer endure the torment of seeing her hard-earned money being wasted while she lived in poverty. Gathering her courage, she decided it was time to confront John, to demand that he change his ways or leave. When John finally stumbled in through the front door, reeking of alcohol, Sarah was ready. She stood up from the couch, her frail frame trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "John," she began, her voice shaky but firm, "we need to talk." John glanced at her with bleary eyes, a smirk playing on his lips. "What now, Ma? You gonna lecture me again?" Sarah took a deep breath, clutching the receipt in her hand. "You've taken all my money, John. I can't live like this anymore. You need to get a job or you need to leave." The smirk vanished from John's face, replaced by a cold, hard look. He took a step towards her, his voice low and menacing. "Leave? You want me to leave, old woman?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. "Yes, John. I can't keep supporting you. You're draining me of everything." John sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can survive without me? Who's going to take care of you, huh? You're too old and weak to manage on your own. You need me, Ma, whether you like it or not." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she realized the truth in his words. She was old and she was weak, but she couldn't go on like this. "John, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm begging you. Find a job, start a new life. I want to help you, but I can't do this anymore." John laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You're pathetic, you know that? You think you can just kick me out? I'll leave when I'm damn good and ready, and not a moment before. And if you ever try to push me again, you'll regret it." With that, John snatched the receipt from her hand, crumpled it up, and threw it on the floor. "Now, get out of my face. I need to sleep." As John stumbled off to his room, Sarah sank back onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it also solidified her resolve. She knew she couldn't go on like this, and she knew what she had to do. Sarah dried her tears and rose to her feet. There was only one way out of this nightmare, and though it terrified her, she was ready to take that step. Tomorrow, she would set her plan in motion, a plan that would free her from John's grip once and for all. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Sarah moved through the small rooms with a heavy heart, aware that today would change everything. She had spent a sleepless night, going over her decision again and again. The weight of her choice hung over her like a dark cloud, but she knew there was no turning back. John was still asleep, sprawled across his bed, his loud snores echoing down the hallway. Sarah avoided looking at him as she passed his room, instead focusing on the task ahead. She needed to gather a few things, items that would help her carry out her plan. She started in the kitchen, carefully selecting a few pieces of food from the meager supplies she had left. A loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She packed the items into a small, worn-out bag, her hands trembling as she did so. Next, she went to her bedroom, opening the drawer where she kept her important documents. Her hands brushed over old photographs, letters, and other mementos of a life that now seemed distant. Finally, she found what she was looking for. A small stash of cash she had managed to hide from John, along with her bank book. She knew it wasn't much, but it was all she had left. She took a deep breath and placed the money in the bag. Sarah glanced at the clock on her bedside table. It was still early, but she knew she didn't have much time. John wouldn't sleep forever, and she needed to be gone before he woke up. As she moved to close the drawer, her eyes fell on a small photograph tucked away at the back. It was a picture of John as a child, smiling brightly at the camera, his arm wrapped around Sarah's shoulders. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Memories of the sweet, loving boy John had once been flooded her mind. She remembered how he used to bring her wildflowers from the field near their old house, how he would curl up beside her during thunderstorms, seeking comfort in her embrace. She remembered the promises she had made to protect him, to love him no matter what. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man she barely recognized. The love she had for him was still there, but it was buried under layers of hurt and fear. Sarah knew that staying would only enable him to continue down the destructive path he was on. She couldn't save him from himself, but she could save herself. Steeling herself, Sarah closed the drawer, leaving the photograph behind. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past any longer. The future was uncertain, but it was the only path left to her. She picked up her bag and moved quietly through the house, careful not to make any noise. As she reached the front door, she paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob. A wave of doubt washed over her. Could she really go through with this? Could she really leave her only child behind? Sarah took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She thought about the years of loneliness and despair, the endless nights spent worrying about how she would survive. She thought about the fear that had become a constant companion, the way John's anger had made her feel small and powerless. But most of all, she thought about the life she still had left to live, a life that could be peaceful, free from the constant anxiety that had plagued her for so long. She knew that if she stayed, there would be no peace, only more suffering. With a newfound resolve, Sarah opened the door and stepped outside. The cool morning air greeted her, and she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The world outside was still and calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside the house she was leaving behind. As she walked down the street, Sarah forced herself not to look back. Every step she took felt like shedding a weight she had carried for too long. Her legs were weak, and her heart ached, but she kept moving forward. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew that anywhere was better than where she had been. Sarah made her way to the bus stop at the end of the street. She had a vague plan in mind, to go to the bank, withdraw whatever money she had left, and then disappear. She would find a small, quiet place where John wouldn't think to look for her. Maybe a small town, far from here, where she could start anew. As she waited for the bus, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what that new life might look like. She pictured herself in a small apartment, filled with sunlight and plants. She would have a routine, simple but fulfilling. She could take walks in the park, maybe even join a book club. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had now. The bus arrived, and Sarah climbed aboard, her body trembling with a mix of fear and anticipation. She took a seat by the window, clutching her bag tightly in her lap. As the bus pulled away, she watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood fade into the distance. Sarah knew this was only the beginning of her journey. There would be challenges ahead, and she was far from safe. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a small light in the darkness that had surrounded her for so long. She was free. The bus rumbled through the early morning streets, its monotonous hum lulling the passengers into a drowsy silence. Sarah sat rigidly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery as the city began to wake up around her. The reality of what she had done was starting to sink in. She had left her son, her home, and everything she had known for the past 25 years. The enormity of it all weighed heavily on her, but underneath the anxiety, there was a flicker of something new: freedom. As the bus turned onto a busier street, Sarah noticed people hurrying to work, parents walking their children to school, and shopkeepers opening their stores for the day. It all seemed so normal, so different from the life she had been living in her small, suffocating house. She wondered if anyone would miss her, if anyone would notice that she was gone. But then, she reminded herself, there had been no one to notice for a long time. John had been her whole world, and he had slowly drained the life out of her. No one else had cared about her, and now she needed to care for herself. Sarah clutched her bag tighter as the bus approached her stop near the bank. She needed to focus on the next step of her plan: securing the money she had left and making her escape permanent. The thought of walking into the bank filled her with dread. She had always been a private person, and the idea of withdrawing all her money in one go made her nervous. But she knew it was necessary. If John found her before she had a chance to disappear, he would take every last cent, leaving her with nothing. The bus came to a halt, and Sarah forced herself to stand. Her knees wobbled as she made her way to the front and stepped off the bus. The crisp morning air greeted her again, but this time, it felt different, more urgent, more real. The bank was only a short walk away, and as she approached the large, glass-fronted building, Sarah felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She hesitated at the entrance, taking a deep breath to steady herself before pushing the door open. Inside, the bank was quiet, with only a few early customers scattered about. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, adding to the sterile atmosphere. Sarah approached the counter, where a young teller greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then forced herself to speak. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," the teller replied, typing something into the computer. "How much would you like to withdraw?" Sarah swallowed hard. "All of it," she said, her voice trembling. The teller's fingers paused on the keyboard, and she looked up at Sarah with a hint of concern. "All of it, ma'am?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, all of it. I need to close the account." The teller's expression softened, and she nodded. "I understand. I'll need to see your identification, please." Sarah handed over her ID and bank book, her hands shaking slightly. As the teller processed the request, Sarah's mind raced. What if John had already noticed she was gone? What if he came looking for her? She needed to get out of the city as soon as possible. "Here you go, ma'am," the teller said, breaking Sarah out of her thoughts. "This is the total amount in your account. I've closed it as you requested. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Sarah glanced at the stack of bills the teller handed her. It was more money than she had seen in years, but she knew it wouldn't last long. She shook her head. "No, thank you. This is all I need." The teller smiled again. "Take care, ma'am." Sarah nodded and tucked the money into her bag, her heart pounding as she turned to leave the bank. Every step she took felt like it echoed through the empty corridors of her mind, reminding her of the finality of her decision. There was no going back now. Outside, the city was beginning to bustle with activity. Sarah hurried down the street, heading toward the train station. She had no particular destination in mind. She just needed to get as far away as possible. Her plan was simple: buy a ticket to a town she had never heard of and start over. No one would know her, and she could live out her remaining years in peace. But as she walked, a troubling thought crept into her mind. What if John found her? He had always been resourceful when it came to getting what he wanted, and she had no doubt he would try to track her down if he realized she was gone. The idea of being hunted by her own son sent a chill down her spine. At the train station, Sarah bought a one-way ticket to a small town several hours away. The name meant nothing to her, But that was exactly what she wanted. As she waited on the platform for her train to arrive, she felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, relief, and a deep, aching sadness. She had loved John with all her heart, but she knew that love had been poisoned long ago. When the train finally pulled into the station, Sarah climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, away from the other passengers. She placed her bag on the seat beside her, as if to protect it from the world outside. As the train began to move, Sarah stared out the window, watching the city fade into the distance. The life she had known was slipping away, and in its place was a vast, unknown future. The thought was terrifying but also exhilarating. For the first time in years, Sarah had the power to decide her own fate. But as the train sped through the countryside, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was far from over. She had escaped, but she knew that freedom was not the same as safety. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, and she would have to be strong to survive it. In the quiet of the train car, Sarah made a silent vow to herself. No matter what lay ahead, she would not let fear control her life any longer. She had lived in the shadow of others for too long, and now it was time to step into the light, no matter how harsh it might be. As the landscape blurred by outside the window, Sarah felt a small, fragile sense of hope bloom within her. She was on her way to a new life, and though she didn't know what that life would hold, she knew one thing for certain: it was hers. The train sped along the tracks, cutting through vast stretches of farmland and thick forests. Sarah watched the scenery pass by, her thoughts tangled with a mix of anticipation and dread. The further she got from the city, the more surreal her escape felt. She was free from John's grasp, but with that freedom came a daunting sense of isolation. She had no one to turn to, no place to call home. She was a stranger in her own life. As the hours ticked by, Sarah found herself growing restless. The quiet hum of the train, once soothing, now felt oppressive. She had always been a practical woman, but the uncertainty of her situation gnawed at her. She had left everything behind, but what if it wasn't enough? What if John tracked her down? The thought of him finding her sent a shiver down her spine. Unable to sit still any longer, Sarah decided to stretch her legs. She left her bag on the seat, glancing nervously at the other passengers as she walked down the narrow aisle. Most of them were engrossed in books or staring blankly out the window, lost in their own worlds. No one paid her any mind. As she moved toward the back of the train, she noticed a small, empty compartment. Grateful for a moment of solitude, she slipped inside and closed the door behind her. The compartment was tiny, with just enough room for a bench and a small table. It smelled faintly of dust and old upholstery, but it was quiet, a small haven from the chaos of her thoughts. Sarah sat down on the bench and leaned her head against the window, closing her eyes. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was the only sound, and for a moment, she allowed herself to relax. She thought of the life she had left behind, the constant fear, the endless arguments with John, the lonely nights spent crying in the dark. She had endured so much, but now, sitting in this tiny compartment, she realized just how strong she had been to finally walk away. But even as she tried to focus on her newfound freedom, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was an instinct she had developed over years of living with John, a sense of unease that crept up on her when danger was near. She opened her eyes and glanced around the compartment, half expecting to see John's angry face glaring back at her. Of course, there was no one there, but the feeling of unease persisted, like a shadow lingering at the edge of her vision. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She was being paranoid, she told herself. John couldn't possibly know where she was. She had been careful, hadn't she? Still, the nagging doubt refused to leave her. With a sigh, Sarah stood up and left the compartment, heading back to her seat. As she walked, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. A man was sitting in the seat directly across from hers, his eyes fixed on the window. He was tall, with a rugged, unshaven face and dark hair that fell over his forehead. He wore a worn leather jacket, and his hands were clenched tightly in his lap. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to recall if he had been there before. She couldn't remember seeing him when she first boarded the train, but she hadn't been paying attention. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to go back to the compartment and hide, but she forced herself to keep walking. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. When she reached her seat, she quickly grabbed her bag and sat down, her heart pounding in her chest. The man didn't look at her, but she could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her. Was he watching her? Or was it just her imagination running wild? Sarah tried to calm herself, but the fear had already taken hold. She kept her eyes trained on the window, pretending to be interested in the passing scenery, but she couldn't stop glancing at the man out of the corner of her eye. He hadn't moved, but his stillness was unsettling, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could John have sent someone after her? Was this man following her on his orders? The thought was terrifying, but Sarah knew she couldn't afford to panic. If the man was following her, she needed to stay calm and think of a way to escape. The train began to slow as it approached the next station. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. This could be her chance. If the man was following her, she needed to get off the train without him noticing. She couldn't let him know where she was going. As the train pulled into the station, Sarah stood up and slung her bag over her shoulder. She tried to act casual, as if she were just another passenger getting off at her stop. The man didn't move, but she could feel his eyes on her as she walked toward the door. When the train came to a full stop, Sarah quickly stepped onto the platform. The station was small and quiet, with only a few other passengers milling about. She glanced around, searching for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The platform was exposed, with only a few benches and a small ticket booth. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized how vulnerable she was. If the man followed her, she would have no way to escape. She turned her head slightly, trying to see if he had gotten off the train, but she couldn't see him through the crowd. Panic surged through her. She had to get out of sight. But where? The station was too small, too open. She was trapped. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A narrow alleyway just beyond the station. It was dark and uninviting, but it was her only option. Without thinking, Sarah darted toward the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. She ducked into the shadows, pressing herself against the cold, damp wall. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she waited, listening for the sound of footsteps. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and Sarah's mind raced with fear. Had he seen her? Was he coming after her? But the only sound she heard was the distant rumble of the train as it pulled away from the station. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah peeked out from the alleyway. The platform was empty, and the man was nowhere in sight. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new sense of urgency. She couldn't stay here. If the man was following her, he might still be nearby, waiting for her to let her guard down. She needed to keep moving to stay one step ahead. But where could she go? She was in a town she didn't know, with no friends, no allies. The isolation that had once seemed like a refuge now felt like a trap. Sarah took a deep breath and forced herself to think. She couldn't stay in one place for too long. She needed to find a place to hide, at least for the night. Tomorrow she would figure out her next move. With renewed determination, Sarah stepped out of the alleyway and began to walk. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the few people she passed. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to keep moving. As she walked through the unfamiliar streets, a cold wind whipped through her thin coat, but she barely noticed. Her mind was focused on one thing: survival. She had come too far to turn back now. She would find a way to stay safe no matter what it took. Sarah walked through the unfamiliar town, each step heavier than the last as exhaustion and anxiety began to take their toll. The narrow streets were lined with old, crumbling buildings that seemed to lean over her like silent sentinels, watching her every move. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that only heightened her sense of dread. She knew she couldn't keep walking forever. She needed to find shelter. She passed a few people along the way, but no one paid her any attention. She was just another face in the crowd, another stranger passing through. That was what she needed to be, anonymous, unremarkable. But as the shadows deepened and the streets grew emptier, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of a door, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sent a shiver down her spine. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see the man from the train, but there was no one there. Still, the unease persisted, gnawing at her like an insidious whisper in the back of her mind. Finally, Sarah spotted a small, dingy motel at the end of the street. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the entrance. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place to hide. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the door and stepped inside. The lobby was just as uninviting as the exterior, dimly lit, with faded wallpaper and a musty smell that hung in the air. A tired-looking woman sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. She barely glanced up as Sarah approached. "Need a room?" the woman asked in a bored tone, her eyes never leaving the pages of her magazine. "Yes, please," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt small and insignificant in this place, like a ghost drifting through a world that had forgotten her. "How long?" the woman asked, finally looking up. Her eyes were cold, indifferent. "Just one night," Sarah said quickly. She didn't plan on staying longer than that. By morning, she hoped to have a clearer idea of where to go next. The woman nodded and slid a form across the counter. Sarah filled it out with shaky hands, using an old pseudonym she hadn't used in years. She handed the form back, along with a few bills from her dwindling supply of cash. "Room 7, the woman said, tossing a key onto the counter. "Down the hall to the left." Sarah took the key, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. "Thank you," she mumbled before hurrying down the hall. The room was as dreary as the rest of the motel, small, with peeling wallpaper and a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. A thin layer of dust coated the furniture, and the bed looked lumpy and uncomfortable. But it was a place to rest, and that was all Sarah needed. She locked the door behind her, then leaned against it, closing her eyes as she tried to calm her racing heart. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the old heating unit in the corner. Sarah felt as though the walls were closing in on her, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. She knew she couldn't stay in this town for long. If the man from the train was really following her, it was only a matter of time before he found her. But where could she go? She had no plan, no destination in mind. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. Sarah felt her knees buckle as she stumbled toward the bed, collapsing onto the lumpy mattress. She stared up at the cracked ceiling, her mind spinning with fear and uncertainty. She couldn't afford to sleep, not now, but her body was betraying her, pulling her deeper into the abyss of fatigue. As she lay there, Sarah's thoughts drifted back to John. She wondered if he had noticed she was gone yet, if he was searching for her. A part of her still longed for the son she had once known, the boy who had loved her, who had been her whole world. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who had brought her nothing but pain. Sarah closed her eyes, forcing the thoughts away. She couldn't afford to think about John, not now. She needed to focus on her own survival. Just as she was about to succumb to the pull of sleep, a sudden noise jolted her awake. It was faint, a soft creak, like the sound of a door opening. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, her breath caught in her throat. The silence was thick, suffocating. But then she heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, closer this time. Someone was outside her door. Sarah's blood ran cold. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. She listened, every nerve in her body on high alert. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, slow and measured, as if someone was deliberately taking their time. Fear gripped her, paralyzing her as the footsteps stopped just outside her door. She could hear the faint rustle of clothing, the soft intake of breath. Whoever it was, they were right there, just inches away, separated only by the thin wooden door. Sarah's mind raced. What should she do? Should she call for help? Should she try to escape? But before she could decide, there was a loud knock on the door, sharp and commanding, making her jump. "Open up!" A male voice called from the other side. The tone was low but firm, an order, not a request. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as she stared at the door, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything. But she was frozen, trapped by the fear that had taken hold of her. The room seemed to close in around her, the air growing thick with tension. "Open the door, ma'am," the voice said again, more insistent this time. Sarah forced herself to move, inching toward the door as quietly as she could. She pressed her ear against it, trying to listen for any clues as to who was on the other side. But the only sound she heard was the steady, shallow breathing of the person waiting for her to respond. Her mind raced through her options. She could ignore the knock, hope that whoever it was would go away. But what if they didn't? What if they forced their way in? She could try to escape through the window, but it was small and likely wouldn't open easily. And if the person outside the door was John, or someone sent by him, she wouldn't stand a chance. Taking a deep breath, Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is it?" There was a pause. Then the voice replied, "Motel management. We received a complaint about noise in this room." Sarah's blood ran cold. Noise? She hadn't made any noise. She had barely moved since entering the room. This was a trap. Her instincts screamed at her not to open the door, not to trust this man. "I'm not making any noise," Sarah called back, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "You must have the wrong room." Another pause. Then the voice grew colder. "Ma'am, please open the door. We need to check." Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the doorknob, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't open the door, but she also knew she couldn't stay in this room. She was trapped, and the walls seemed to close in on her with every passing second. Finally, she made a decision. As quietly as she could, Sarah moved away from the door and headed toward the small window. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with the latch, trying to get it open. The rusty mechanism groaned in protest, but she managed to force it open just enough to slip through. She could hear the man outside the door growing more impatient, his voice rising as he demanded that she open up. But Sarah didn't stop. She squeezed through the narrow window, scraping her arms on the rough edges, and dropped down onto the cold ground below. The alley behind the motel was dark and empty, the shadows deep and oppressive. Sarah's legs wobbled as she stumbled away from the building, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away from the motel as quickly as possible. She didn't look back, didn't dare glance over her shoulder to see if the man was following her. She just kept moving, her feet pounding against the pavement as she ran through the maze of darkened streets. Her mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline, but one thought stood out above all others. She had to keep running. She had to stay ahead no matter what. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted through the narrow, twisting streets of the town. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it, her entire being focused on one thing: escaping. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the danger she was in. The town was a maze of unfamiliar alleys and side streets, and as Sarah ran, she tried to map out a path in her mind. But the darkness made everything look the same, and soon she found herself disoriented, unsure of which direction to take. Panic clawed at her, but she forced herself to keep moving, her instincts driving her forward. She turned a corner and found herself on a deserted street lined with closed shops and darkened windows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing off the buildings. Sarah's eyes darted from side to side, searching for any sign of movement, but the street was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone was lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. She needed to find a place to hide, to catch her breath and think. Up ahead, she spotted an old, run-down building with a narrow alley beside it. Without hesitation, Sarah darted into the alley, pressing herself against the rough brick wall. She crouched down, trying to make herself as small as possible, her body trembling from the cold and fear. For a moment, the world was silent, save for the pounding of her heart in her ears. She strained to listen, her breath held as she waited for any sound of pursuit. The seconds stretched on, each one more agonizing than the last. But all she heard was the faint rustling of the wind through the alley, a soft, almost mocking whisper. Sarah's mind raced. Who had been at her door? Was it really someone sent by John, or had her fear driven her to imagine things? She couldn't be sure, but the danger felt real, too real to dismiss. She knew she couldn't stay in the alley forever, but she was too afraid to move, too afraid to expose herself to whoever might be out there. She thought back to the man on the train, the way he had seemed to appear out of nowhere, watching her with those cold, unreadable eyes. Had he followed her to the motel? Was he the one who had knocked on her door? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. As she crouched in the shadows, Sarah's thoughts turned to John. It wasn't like him to involve other people in his schemes. He preferred to handle things himself. But she knew he was desperate, and desperation could drive people to do things they wouldn't normally do. If he had sent someone after her, it meant he was serious about finding her, and that thought filled her with dread. Sarah's legs were beginning to cramp, but she didn't dare move. She needed to stay hidden, to wait until she was sure it was safe to come out. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence began to weigh on her. The stillness of the night, once a comfort, now felt suffocating, as if the darkness itself was closing in on her. Then, she heard it. A soft footstep, barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. Her heart froze as she listened, her eyes wide with fear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying to move quietly, not wanting to be heard. Sarah pressed herself harder against the wall, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the alley. She could see the shadow of a figure on the ground, long and menacing, cast by the dim light of a distant street lamp. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that whoever it was would move on, that they wouldn't notice her hiding there. But the figure didn't move. It lingered at the entrance to the alley, as if sensing her presence, waiting for her to reveal herself. The silence was unbearable. Sarah could feel the tension building, the fear clawing at her insides. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was paralyzed, trapped in her own terror. The seconds stretched on, each one more agonizing than the last, until finally the figure moved. It was slow at first, just a slight shift in the shadow. But then the footsteps resumed, coming closer, echoing off the walls of the alley. Sarah's heart raced as the figure drew nearer, the sound of their approach filling her with dread. She couldn't stay hidden any longer. If she didn't move now, she would be caught. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah sprang to her feet and bolted from the alley, her legs burning as she pushed herself to run faster than she ever had before. The footsteps behind her quickened, pounding against the pavement as they gave chase. Sarah's breath came in desperate gasps, her vision blurring as she sprinted through the narrow streets. She could hear the figure gaining on her, could feel their presence looming behind her like a dark cloud. She turned down another street, her mind barely registering the blur of buildings as she ran. She needed to find a place to hide, but the town was a maze, and she was hopelessly lost. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Up ahead, she saw a small park, its entrance marked by a pair of old wrought-iron gates. Without thinking, she veered toward it, hoping that the darkness and the trees would offer some cover. She darted through the gates and into the park, her feet pounding against the gravel path as she searched for a place to hide. The park was deserted, the swings and benches empty, their shadows long and eerie in the moonlight. Sarah's eyes darted around, looking for anywhere she could conceal herself. But there was nothing. No bushes, no statues, just wide open space. Desperation clawed at her. She could hear the footsteps behind her growing louder, closing in. She had to do something, anything. Her gaze fell on a large tree near the edge of the park, its trunk wide and gnarled. It wasn't much, but it was her only option. With the last of her strength, Sarah sprinted toward the tree, ducking behind it just as the footsteps reached the park. She pressed herself against the rough bark, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She could hear the figure moving through the park, their footsteps slow and deliberate, searching. Sarah's mind raced, trying to think of a plan, but she was too exhausted, too scared to think clearly. She could only hope that the darkness and the shadows would hide her, that the figure would give up and leave. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the figure now, moving slowly through the park, their silhouette dark and menacing against the pale moonlight. They were searching, looking for her, and she knew that if they found her, there would be no escape. She held her breath, praying that the shadows would be enough to keep her hidden. The figure stopped just a few feet from the tree, their head turning as they scanned the area. Sarah's body was rigid, every muscle tense as she waited, her fear so intense it felt like it was suffocating her. Then, the figure turned away, their footsteps retreating as they moved deeper into the park. Sarah didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. She waited until the footsteps faded into the distance, until the silence of the night returned. Slowly, cautiously, she peeked out from behind the tree. The park was empty, the figure gone. But Sarah knew better than to assume she was safe. Whoever had been following her was still out there, still looking for her. And she couldn't stay here. With her heart still pounding, Sarah slipped out from behind the tree and began to move again, this time more cautiously. She kept to the shadows, her steps quiet and deliberate as she made her way through the park and back onto the streets. The town was still dark and silent, but Sarah could feel the presence of danger all around her. She needed to find a place to rest, to think, but she knew she couldn't stay in this town any longer. She needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of whoever was chasing her. As she walked through the empty streets, Sarah felt a cold, gnawing fear settle in the pit of her stomach. She had escaped once, but she knew that the danger wasn't over. The enemy was still out there, unseen and relentless, and she had to stay one step ahead. She was alone in this fight, but she was determined to survive. No matter how long it took, no matter how far she had to run, she would find a way to stay safe. She had to. With renewed resolve, Sarah kept walking, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop. Not now, not ever. As the night deepened, Sarah continued her journey through the dark, unfamiliar streets. Every shadow seemed to shift with malice. Every whisper of the wind felt like a threat. She had always prided herself on being strong, resilient, but now she was on the brink of collapse, driven by sheer fear and a primal instinct to survive. She reached a quieter part of town, where the buildings were fewer and the streets narrower. The town seemed to be sleeping, but Sarah knew she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She was being hunted, and the predator could be anywhere. A small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly, appeared at the end of the street. Sarah's stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since she fled the motel. She hesitated for a moment, considering the risks, but the prospect of sitting in a brightly lit place, even for just a few minutes, was too tempting to resist. She needed to regroup, to think, and maybe even to find a way out of this nightmare. The bell above the diner door jingled as she entered, and the warm, greasy scent of fried food filled her senses. The diner was nearly empty, with only a couple of tired-looking truck drivers hunched over their plates at the counter. They barely glanced up as Sarah slid into a booth near the back, her back to the wall so she could keep an eye on the door. A weary waitress, with lines etched deep into her face, approached Sarah's table. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless. "Just a coffee," Sarah replied, her voice sounding small and shaky. "And maybe a sandwich." The waitress nodded, jotting down the order. "Be right back." Sarah sat in silence, her eyes darting around the room, taking in every detail. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder that time was running out. She didn't have a plan, didn't know where to go next. She was running on pure adrenaline, and she knew it couldn't last forever. The waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee and a simple sandwich, placing them on the table with a tired smile. "Anything else you need? Just holler," she said before turning away. Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. She took a sip, the bitter liquid jolting her awake, if only for a moment. As she bit into the sandwich, her mind raced with possibilities. She needed to leave town, but she couldn't risk taking another train. The bus station was an option, but if someone was watching her, they would expect her to head there. The sound of the bell jingling at the door startled her, and she looked up, her heart skipping a beat. A man had entered the diner, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him, the man from the train. He didn't look at her as he walked to the counter and took a seat, but Sarah knew it was no coincidence that he was here. He was following her, and he was closing in. Sarah's hands trembled as she set the sandwich down. She had to stay calm, had to think clearly. She couldn't let him know that she had seen him, couldn't let him know she was on to him. She needed to leave, but she couldn't do it too quickly, or he would follow. Forcing herself to act normal, Sarah took another sip of her coffee, her mind racing. She couldn't risk running out the front door. If he was watching her, he would follow. She needed another way out, a way to slip out of the diner without him noticing. She glanced around the room, searching for an escape route. Her eyes landed on a door near the back, marked with a small sign that read restrooms. Her heart leaped with hope. There was a chance that door led to an alley or a back exit. Sarah took a deep breath, then slowly stood up, trying to keep her movements casual. She walked toward the restroom door, her steps measured, her expression neutral. She could feel the man's eyes on her, but she didn't look back. She couldn't afford to show any sign of fear. The restroom door creaked as she pushed it open, and she slipped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The small, dingy restroom smelled faintly of bleach and mildew. There was a single window, small and barred, letting in only a sliver of moonlight. Sarah glanced around, searching for another exit. Her eyes landed on a second door at the far end of the room, partially hidden by a mop and bucket. She crossed the small space in a few quick steps and pressed her ear against the door. Silence. It was her only chance. She opened the door slowly, cringing at the soft creak of the hinges. Beyond the door was a narrow, dark alley, littered with trash and debris. It wasn't ideal, but it was a way out. Sarah took one last deep breath and stepped into the alley, closing the door behind her as quietly as she could. The air was cold, and the shadows seemed to press in on her from all sides. She stood still for a moment, listening for any sound of pursuit, but all she heard was the distant hum of the town. She began to move, keeping close to the walls, her footsteps silent on the damp ground. The alley twisted and turned, and Sarah followed its path, hoping it would lead her to safety. As she turned another corner, she heard it, a faint sound, like the crunch of gravel underfoot. Someone was behind her. Panic surged through her, and Sarah quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, and the darkness was suffocating. She could hear the footsteps growing louder, closer, until they were almost on top of her. Without thinking, Sarah broke into a run, her fear propelling her forward. The walls of the alley blurred as she sprinted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. Suddenly, the alley opened up into a small courtyard, surrounded by tall, looming buildings. Sarah skidded to a stop, her eyes darting around for an escape route. But there was none. The courtyard was a dead end. She was trapped. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her back against the wall. The footsteps had stopped, and the alley behind her was silent. But she knew he was there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Desperation clawed at her as she searched for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the courtyard closed in around her, the darkness pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She was cornered, and she knew it. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to defend herself, but she had nothing, no weapon, no plan. She was alone, and the man was closing in. She could feel it, the cold, creeping dread that had been building since she first saw him on the train. And then, out of the silence, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible click, like the sound of a gun being cocked. The blood drained from Sarah's face as she realized the truth. This wasn't just about following her. This was about ending her. Before she could react, a figure stepped out of the shadows, the dim light catching the glint of metal in his hand. The man from the train, his expression cold and devoid of emotion, raised the gun and pointed it directly at her. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stared down the barrel of the gun. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but her body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The man took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers, and Sarah knew that this was it. There was no escape, no last-minute miracle. She had been running for so long, but now, in this dark, lonely courtyard, her journey had come to an end. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But just as the man's finger tightened on the trigger, a voice rang out from the shadows, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Drop the gun." Sarah's eyes snapped open in shock, her heart skipping a beat. The man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the source of the voice. In the darkness, she could make out a second figure, standing at the entrance to the alley, a gun raised and pointed at the man who had been stalking her. "I said, drop the gun," the voice repeated, this time more forcefully. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. The man's grip on the gun tightened, and Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, the uncertainty. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun, his expression hardening into one of cold, calculated anger. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving the figure in the shadows. "You're making a mistake," the man growled, his voice low and menacing. But the second figure didn't waver. "The only mistake being made here is yours," the voice replied, calm and steady. "Now walk away, and don't come back." The man hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenched in frustration. But then, with one last glare at Sarah, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps echoing off the walls of the alley as he retreated. Sarah stood frozen, her mind reeling as she tried to process what had just happened. The figure in the shadows lowered their gun and stepped forward, moving into the dim light of the courtyard. As they drew closer, Sarah could see them more clearly. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern but not unfriendly expression. He stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze softening as he took in her terrified state. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Sarah nodded shakily, her body trembling with the adrenaline that was still coursing through her veins. "Who are you?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The man gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm here to help," he said simply. "You're not alone anymore." Sarah's legs buckled, and she stumbled forward, her strength finally giving out. The man caught her before she could fall, steadying her with a firm grip. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice calming. "You're safe." But even as she clung to his arm, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. She had escaped death, but the darkness was still out there, still lurking in the shadows. And she knew that she couldn't stop running, not yet. Not until she was truly free. Sarah's body trembled as the stranger helped her to her feet. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her weak and shaken. Her mind was a swirl of confusion and fear, but one thought cut through the haze. She was still alive. Whoever this man was, he had saved her. He kept a steady grip on her arm as they moved out of the courtyard and back into the maze of alleys. The town was still quiet, but Sarah's nerves were frayed, and every sound made her flinch. The stranger seemed to sense her unease and spoke softly as they walked. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "That man won't give up easily, and we're too exposed here." Sarah nodded, unable to find her voice. She was still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The dark figure who had been stalking her, the man who had nearly killed her, he was gone, but the danger wasn't. She could feel it, like a storm cloud hanging over her head, ready to burst at any moment. The stranger led her through a series of narrow streets, his pace quick but controlled. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, and Sarah found herself following him without question. She didn't have the energy to think, to argue. All she could do was trust that he was leading her to safety. Finally, they reached a small, nondescript car parked on a quiet side street. The man opened the passenger door and gestured for Sarah to get in. She hesitated for a moment, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. She was about to get into a car with a man she didn't know, a man who had appeared out of nowhere. But the memory of the gun pointed at her was still fresh in her mind, and she knew she didn't have many options. With a deep breath, she climbed into the car. The man closed the door behind her and quickly got into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and within moments, they were speeding through the deserted streets, leaving the town behind. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement. Sarah stared out the window, watching the dark landscape rush by. She didn't know where they were going, and she didn't ask. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed. After what felt like hours, the man finally broke the silence. "My name's David," he said, glancing at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "You're safe now, but we need to put some distance between us and that town." Sarah nodded, her voice still trapped in her throat. She wanted to thank him, to ask him who he was and why he had helped her. But the word, instead, she just stared at him, trying to piece together the fragments of her shattered thoughts. David seemed to sense her struggle and spoke again, his tone gentle. "I know you've been through a lot, but you're going to be okay. I'll make sure of it." "Why?" The word slipped out before Sarah could stop it. Her voice was small, trembling with a mix of fear and confusion. "Why are you helping me?" David was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Let's just say I don't like seeing people in trouble," he said finally. "Especially when they're being hunted by someone like that." Sarah's stomach twisted at the word hunted. That was exactly how she felt, as if she were prey, and the man who had been following her was the predator. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. "Who was he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's jaw tightened, and he hesitated before answering. "He's a professional," he said grimly. "A hired gun. Someone put a price on your head." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she felt a cold dread settle in her chest. "You mean John?" David nodded. "It's likely. Whoever hired that man wanted you dead, and they were willing to pay for it." Sarah's mind reeled. She had known John was dangerous, but this, hiring someone to kill her, the realization was like a punch to the gut. John wasn't just trying to find her, he was trying to eliminate her. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to keep herself from breaking down. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. She had to stay strong, to keep moving. "Why would he do this?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than to David. "Why would he want me dead?" David glanced at her, his expression softening. "You know why," he said gently. "You're the only one who stood in his way, the only one who could expose him." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of David's words pressing down on her. She had always known John was controlling, manipulative, but she had never imagined he would go this far. The boy she had raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, and Sarah buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. The fear, the pain, the betrayal, it was all too much. She had left everything behind, but it hadn't been enough. John's reach was long, and he wasn't going to stop until she was gone. David didn't say anything as she cried. He just drove, his expression focused and determined. But there was a softness in his eyes, a silent understanding of the pain she was going through. After a while, Sarah's sobs subsided, and she wiped her eyes, her chest aching with the effort. She felt drained, hollow, but the fear had been replaced by something else. Anger. John had tried to take everything from her, But she wasn't going to let him win. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to give up now. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steadier than before. David glanced at her, then back at the road. "I know a place," he said. "It's safe off the grid. You can lay low there until we figure out our next move." Sarah nodded, a small flicker of hope igniting in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't facing it alone. As the car sped through the night, leaving the town far behind, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this after all. The car sped through the dark countryside, the lights of the town fading into the distance. Sarah watched the moonlit fields rush by, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear, anger, and exhaustion. She had no idea where David was taking her, but there was a strange comfort in the fact that someone was helping her, guiding her through this nightmare. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. David drove in silence, his focus unwavering as the road twisted and turned through the rural landscape. Sarah stole glances at him, trying to gauge who this man was. A stranger who had saved her life, a man who seemed to know too much about her situation. She wanted to ask more questions, to understand why he had intervened, but she was too drained to probe. For now, she was content to trust him, to let him take the lead. After what felt like hours, the car turned onto a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense trees. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the overgrown path ahead. Sarah's anxiety spiked as the car bumped along the uneven road, but David remained calm, guiding the car with practiced ease. "Where are we?" Sarah finally asked, her voice low and hesitant. "We're almost there," David replied, his eyes on the road. "It's a place I know, a cabin off the grid. You'll be safe there." The words safe and cabin didn't quite fit together in Sarah's mind. She imagined a remote, isolated place in the woods where no one could find her or help her if things went wrong. But she had no other choice. She had to trust David. She had come too far to turn back now. The road narrowed further until it was little more than a trail cutting through the trees. The car jolted over rocks and roots, and Sarah gripped the seat, her heart pounding. Finally, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing, and in the center of it stood a weathered cabin, barely visible in the moonlight. David parked the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Sarah stared at the cabin, her breath catching in her throat. It was small and unassuming, its wooden walls worn by time and weather. A single light shone dimly in the window, casting a warm, inviting glow. "This is it," David said, breaking the silence. He turned to look at Sarah, his expression serious. "It's not much, but it's safe. No one will find you here." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with a mix of fear and gratitude. She didn't know how long she would have to stay in this place, or what her next move would be, but she knew she couldn't keep running forever. At least here, in this secluded cabin, she could rest, gather her strength, and plan her next steps. David got out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door for her. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get inside." Sarah stepped out of the car, her legs shaky from the long drive. The night air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. She followed David to the cabin, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. As they reached the door, David pulled out a key and unlocked it, pushing the door open with a creak. The interior of the cabin was small but cozy. A single room with a kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a small bed in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves filled with canned goods, books, and other essentials. It was clear that someone had prepared this place to be lived in, to be a refuge. David motioned for Sarah to enter, and she stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloping her like a blanket. She felt a strange sense of relief, as if the walls of the cabin could shield her from the horrors she had faced. David closed the door behind them and turned on a small lamp on the table, casting a soft light over the room. He glanced at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "There's food, water, and everything you need here," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You can stay as long as you need." Sarah looked around the cabin, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. "How do you know about this place?" she asked, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. David hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I've used it before for situations like this. It's a safe house, a place to go when there's nowhere else." His answer raised more questions than it answered, but Sarah didn't press him. She was too tired to unravel the mystery of who David was and how he knew so much about her situation. All that mattered was that she was safe for now. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." He moved to the small stove and started a fire, the flames crackling as they took hold. The warmth spread through the cabin, chasing away the chill of the night. Sarah watched him, her mind struggling to make sense of everything that had happened. She had been running for so long, and now, for the first time, she had stopped. It felt strange, surreal, as if the danger was still lurking just outside the door. "You should get some rest," David said, turning to her. "You've been through a lot, and you'll need your strength." Sarah nodded, though the idea of sleep felt impossible. Her mind was still racing, replaying the events of the night over and over. But she knew he was right. She needed to rest, to let her body recover from the strain of constant fear. David pointed to the bed in the corner. "You can take the bed. I'll stay up and keep watch." The thought of lying down, of closing her eyes and letting go of the tension that had gripped her for so long, was both tempting and terrifying. But she trusted David, at least enough to let herself rest. She walked over to the bed and sat down, the mattress creaking softly under her weight. As she pulled the blankets around her, Sarah looked up at David, who had settled into a chair near the door, his eyes scanning the room as if he were expecting trouble. The sight of him, so calm and vigilant, brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. David looked at her, his expression softening. "Because everyone deserves a chance to escape," he said quietly. "And because sometimes, helping someone else is the only way to make up for your own mistakes." There was a sadness in his eyes, a weight that Sarah recognized. She didn't know what David's past held, but she understood the burden of guilt, the need for redemption. It was something she had lived with for a long time. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with emotion. David just nodded, his gaze returning to the door. "Get some sleep, Sarah. I'll be here." With that, Sarah allowed herself to lie back on the bed, her body sinking into the worn mattress. The fire crackled softly in the stove, and the warmth of the cabin enveloped her, easing the tension in her muscles. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she closed her eyes and let herself drift into the embrace of sleep. As the darkness of sleep took hold, Sarah felt a sense of relief. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she was safe, and that was enough. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside the cabin. The soft, natural light of dawn filtered through the small window, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented, the events of the previous night a blur in her mind. But as her surroundings came into focus, reality rushed back, and the weight of her situation settled heavily on her chest. She was still alive, still safe, but the fear hadn't left her. It lingered in the corners of her mind, a constant reminder that the danger wasn't over. John was still out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he found her. Sarah pushed herself up from the bed, the blanket falling away as she swung her legs over the side. Her body ached, a dull reminder of the physical and emotional strain she had endured. But there was also a strange sense of calm, a brief reprieve from the terror that had gripped her for so long. She was safe, at least for the moment, and she needed to make the most of it. As she stood, she noticed that David was no longer in the chair by the door. A pang of anxiety shot through her. Had he left? But then she heard the soft clatter of dishes from the small kitchenette, and the scent of coffee filled the air. Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. He was still here. She made her way to the kitchen, where David stood at the stove, a small pot of coffee brewing beside a skillet of scrambled eggs. He looked up as she entered, offering her a small smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and calm. "I figured you could use a good breakfast." Sarah nodded, grateful for the kindness. "Thank you," she replied, her voice still groggy from sleep. She took a seat at the small table, her mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. David poured her a cup of coffee and set a plate of eggs in front of her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat across from her. Sarah took a sip of the coffee, savoring the warmth that spread through her. "Better," she admitted, "but still afraid." David nodded, his expression serious. "That's normal. What you've been through. It's not something you can just shake off. But you're safe here. We have some time to figure things out." Sarah stared down at her plate, her appetite dulled by the anxiety that still gnawed at her. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "I can't keep running forever." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "We need to come up with a plan. The first thing is to make sure we're truly off the grid, that there's no way for John or anyone else to track you here. After that, we can figure out our next move." Sarah nodded, though the prospect of planning her next steps felt overwhelming. She had been in survival mode for so long, reacting to the immediate danger, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the future. Now, the idea of facing John, of confronting the situation head-on, filled her with dread. "Why is he doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm his mother. I never thought he'd go this far." David sighed, his expression somber. "I don't know John, but I've seen people like him before. When someone like that feels cornered, they become desperate. It's not about love or loyalty anymore, it's about control, power. He sees you as a threat, and he's trying to eliminate that threat." Sarah's heart ached at the words, the truth of them cutting deep. She had always known there was something dark in John, something that had changed him over the years. But she had never imagined it would lead to this. A manhunt, a life on the run. David's voice softened. "But you're stronger than he thinks, Sarah. You've already done the hardest part, you've broken free. Now we just have to make sure he can't pull you back." Sarah nodded, trying to absorb his words, to believe in the strength he saw in her. But the fear was still there, lurking in the background, whispering that she wasn't strong enough, that John would find her, that it was only a matter of time. "How long do we have?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. David hesitated, then spoke with a measured calm. "Not long. The man who was after you, he won't give up easily. If he reports back that he lost you, John will likely send more people, or he might come himself." Sarah's stomach tightened at the thought. The idea of John coming after her personally, of seeing him again, terrified her. She had seen the darkness in his eyes, the cold anger that had replaced the love he once had for her. She wasn't sure she could face him, not after everything that had happened. "What do we do if he finds us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes met hers, and she saw a steely resolve there, a determination that both reassured and frightened her. "We won't let that happen," he said firmly. "But if it comes to that, we'll be ready. You're not alone in this, Sarah. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." The sincerity in his voice brought a lump to Sarah's throat. She had been alone for so long, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. But now, with David's support, she felt a flicker of hope, a small spark that maybe, just maybe, she could get through this. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done." David shook his head, his expression gentle. "You don't have to repay me, Sarah. Just stay strong, and don't give up. We'll get through this together." Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by her vulnerability. But David didn't seem to mind. His gaze was understanding, kind. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her finally finding its way out. "You don't even know me." David hesitated, his eyes darkening with a memory. "Let's just say I've been where you are," he said quietly. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to have someone hunting you down. I couldn't save someone once, and I've regretted it every day since. Helping you, it's my way of trying to make things right." Sarah looked at him, her heart aching for the pain he was clearly carrying. She didn't know his story, but she recognized the burden of guilt, the weight of trying to atone for something that could never be undone. In that moment, she realized that they weren't so different. Two lost souls, trying to survive in a world that had turned against them. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." David nodded, his expression softening. "You're welcome, Sarah. We'll get through this one step at a time." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was still fraught with danger, but she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. After breakfast, David insisted on checking the perimeter of the cabin, making sure there were no signs that they had been followed. Sarah watched him from the window, her anxiety rising as he disappeared into the trees. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made her heart race. But David moved with confidence, his eyes scanning the area with a practiced precision that reassured her. When he finally returned, he looked satisfied. "Everything's clear," he said, giving her a small smile. "We're safe for now." Sarah nodded, though the knot of fear in her stomach remained. She knew they were only buying time, that the danger was still out there, waiting. But she also knew that she couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face John, to confront the man her son had become. But not today. Today, she needed to rest, to gather her strength for the battles ahead. David spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin, checking the locks, and making sure they had enough supplies. He explained to Sarah how the cabin's location made it difficult to find, how the dense forest acted as a natural barrier, shielding them from prying eyes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Sarah felt a sense of calm settle over her. The cabin, with its warm light and sturdy walls, felt like a fortress, a place where she could finally breathe. David cooked a simple dinner, and they ate in silence, the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to their thoughts. Sarah could feel the tension in her body slowly unwinding, the fear that had gripped her for so long beginning to loosen its hold. But as night fell and the cabin grew dark, the old fears began to creep back in. The silence of the forest, once soothing, now felt ominous, as if the trees themselves were hiding something. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was lurking just beyond the light of the cabin. She tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the safety of the cabin, the presence of David. But the fear was persistent, a shadow that refused to be banished. As she lay in bed that night, the firelight flickering on the walls, Sarah found herself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, her heart heavy with the weight of the choices she had made. She had left everything behind, but had it been enough? Was there really a way out of this nightmare? David had promised to keep her safe, but Sarah knew that even he couldn't protect her from everything. The danger was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it found them. But as she lay there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of her own breathing, a thought began to take shape in her mind. She had been running for so long, trying to escape, trying to survive. But maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to fight back. Sarah's heart pounded at the thought, the idea both terrifying and exhilarating. She had always seen herself as weak, as someone who needed to be protected. But maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than she realized. Maybe she had the power to take control of her own fate. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't live in fear any longer. She had to take a stand, to fight for her freedom, her life. And with David by her side, she felt like she had a chance. As the fire burned low and the darkness deepened, Sarah finally allowed herself to close her eyes. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was filled with dreams of a future where she was no longer running, no longer afraid. A future where she was free,